right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm Jessica Magooch. I'll be your hostess for the evening. It is evening here on the East Coast. I'm from Philly as well. Let's get some engagement in the chat and let us know where you are dialing in from today and why you're here. And that could be something like, I'm here because I would like to learn blank. It would be really helpful for us to make sure we get you the right content for today and make it valuable for everybody. Brooklyn in the house. All right, British Columbia. Where are we here? All right, cool. Oh gosh, this is San Francisco. Nice. Bay Area, Atlanta. Awesome. Jersey, Philly, Hawaii. Oh, Moana from Hawaii. Is this true? That's amazing. All right. Keep putting those in there so we can see where everyone's from. Today we're going to be going over viewpoints on sales enablement, goal setting strategies and best practices, keys to implementation and adoption and effectiveness. And then we'll do taking a look forward into technologies, trends, and expectations for the future. So I would love to introduce our guest for the night, Lawrence Cole. He is a visionary tech GM and thought leader builder. He's managed over $2 billion in P&L. He's a product of diverse interdisciplinary career experiences across multiple industries and functions, with spikes of functional expertise in general management, operations, sales and enablement, marketing, organizational leadership, diversity, inclusion, and strategy, and an industry expertise in ad tech, software, shipping and logistics, both CPG and e-commerce retail. Quite impressive. He's proven at business and org-wide transformation with global reach and impact. He gravitates towards opportunities that need to be built from scratch, fixed and reformed or reimagined for the future, with shrewd sensitivity to a triple bottom line of people, profits, and society. He has been an industry keynote and workshop speaker at General Mills, Pluralsight, BYU, and multiple conferences, and author of multiple industry white papers. He's the creator of diversity, equity, and inclusion programming with global reach, including Google's C-suite. Thank you, Lawrence, so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jessica.
Well, so this is how this is going to work, guys. I am going, we have some questions that we've collected that I'll be, hosting, throwing out to Lawrence, and I'm sure he has some things he's come with that he wants to cover as well. Please use the chat to drop in any questions that you have. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so we'll be pulling out some of the most relevant questions. And if appropriate, we'll take you off mute so that you can further elaborate on your question. Sound good? All right. Okay, Lawrence, so what is sales enablement and why should I care about it?
Yeah. So, my way of thinking is that unless you have a study with data, there's ever rarely just one definition. But I'll encapsulate that as best I can. I truly believe that sales enablement speaks to how you power a sales force at scale. And what I really mean by that, powering a sales force, means what are all of the things that help these people to do their job, do it well, to be able to meet the company's goals? How are you training them? How are you incentivizing them? What is the culture? What are they accountable to? What are the metrics that matter? There's a lot of different pieces of that. And doing it at scale means that it's more than just like a person, right? Sales is extremely important. I read somewhere that it was an opinion, but I believe the opinion, that if you look at almost any industry, the top person is the best salesperson. Oprah Winfrey, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, name an industry and you tell me who's at the very top. They are the person who tells the best stories. They're the person who's great at influencing people and getting them to change behavior. So I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I'll put that out as an example and say that when you're doing this at scale, where there's a number of people, and it doesn't have to be a big team, but it definitely is more than, let's say, one or two people. Sales enablement is defined that way to me.
Nice. So you had mentioned that you gave a little bit of your spin on what is sales, influencing people and getting them to change. So sales enablement is then, you know, further supporting that mission to help salespeople better do that. Is that a summary of what
Absolutely.
you?
And it's critical. I mean, one of the things that a friend and mentor told me years ago, and just like a peek into the story of how I even got into sales. I was an engineer that had gotten laid off of my first job. And a
Okay.
woman that I respect to this day told me, look, if you ever want to run a company, you should learn how to sell something. Because in capitalism, nothing happens in business until a sale is made. And so I've just never forgotten that.
Nice. So very important part of the organization. My definition, you know, I describe companies as there's sales and then everyone else that supports sales. Might be biased.
That is true in some companies, and that's a learning I've had over the years. It's really important to understand what is at the forefront of your company's strategy. I've been in places where it was the product, it's been the service, it's been the sales team, it's been the operations team, because that actually influences prioritization and sometimes how difficult or easy it is for you to do your job. So that's a very keen insight.
Nice. And so how long have you been focused in your career on sales enablement?
That is not, there's not a direct answer to that question. I'll say formally, I have been in a formal sales enablement executive role for a little over a year. But the thing about sales enablement is that it's actually not a job. It's about the things that you're doing. And a part of the reason that I even got the role that I got now is because as a sales director, as a sales manager, I had demonstrated over and over and over and over and over that I was very engaged in empowering my salespeople. I've created my own trainings, I've created my own processes, I've done whatever I've had to do to say, how can I take that 95% and make it 96? How can I make it 98? What are the levers that we can pull? And if it's not a priority for this business to give me those resources centrally, I'll just make them. Or the team will get together and we'll make them. I liken it to whenever you go to like arts and crafts or Walmart and you see the teachers there who are spending all their own money buying supplies because they really care about how well kids learn. And I've always been that way when it came to sales.
Very cool. And what I've noticed is, you know, sales enablement as a role is not that old, right? So as its own role, it used to be, you know, the sales manager did all that. But sales managers never have time to do all of the coaching that they want to. How have you seen sales enablement change over the years? And what was your biggest, you know, learning aha for that time?
Now, I actually see this a little bit differently. I actually think it's very old. Um, I think sales enablement is probably the second oldest profession in the world.
Oh, okay. Here we go.
Sales
Tell me
itself,
why.
enabling salespeople at the least, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you saw it. The difference is that the language has changed, the cachet has changed, it's hot, it's sexy. The internet, social media, LinkedIn has just increased a lot of people's awareness to how you classify different jobs. But if I look, you know, back before I was born, you know, those old door-to-door sales companies like Fuller Brush, there was training, there were materials, there was a script, there was a briefcase. I can remember being a little kid with the rainbow vacuum cleaner guy, if I'm aging myself, coming to our house and spending like 3 hours. And I'll be like, Mom, please, let's buy this vacuum cleaner. She's like, I
So
can't
he'll go
afford
home.
it. Sales enablement has been here for as long as sales went beyond one person doing it. Because the smaller your organization is, I think the more, and I don't have data for this, but I believe it very strongly, the more you are dependent on the actual talent. You need a hot salesperson who just like has swagger and gets it and can just get those yeses. The more people you add to that, you lean a lot more on the process. You know, one thing that one of my mentors within Google always, you know, repeated to me is that no matter what you're doing, you always start with your strategy first, then your structure, and then you put the people into it. And so depending on how you answer those questions, sales enablement can look very different at different places, but I do believe that it's been around for a long time. It wasn't called that. When I was a salesperson, it was called sales operations, but it probably existed
Right.
before that was like a formal job. And there may have been a time when managers, I do think over the time, to your point, it's gone more so from a manager-driven function to a central function. But there's no way, if you're on a door-to-door sales company, that a manager can do everything you need if you're flying across the country trying to sell Bibles.
What did you start selling, by the way? What was your first sales job?
Oh gosh, telemarketing.
Cool.
Yeah, my very first sales job.
I gotta put in our time.
Well, I mean, maybe not, right? So I'll say this. I'm thankful for my path because I have had the opportunity to work in a lot of different types of sales organizations that I didn't always appreciate. I didn't always like them and think they were the sexiest company. But that has given me a great deal of perspective where I understand that there isn't just one way to do things. It really just depends on what you're optimizing for. So when I first started selling, I didn't want to sell. I didn't have a job, and all engineers are out of jobs because the dot-com bomb had burst. I worked at an internet company. I was brand new, and then 9/11 happened a few months later. So everyone was out of a job, and they were hiring. I went from telemarketing to insurance sales, which is cold calling, leads, small business owners, and I went from insurance to corporate sales. And I've been in and out of corporate sales. I haven't had a straight through sales career. I've dipped in and out of it at different times.
Nice. Okay. So what are the top 3 elements that must be in a sales enablement program? I say 3, but whatever you think the top number should be.
I would say that you got to have a strategy that is designed to hit the metrics that are most important to the business. That's 1. 2, for me, would be prioritization. Not all things are important. And to be honest, that was always a hard one for me to learn because I'm very engaged and I like to do a lot of things. And I tend to lean towards wanting to boil the ocean and having to really hold myself back and say, you know what are just the 2 things that we're going to focus on this year that are more important than anything else? And the third thing, as I would say, is actually alignment. Alignment, not even training, because, and the alignment piece, I think matters more in larger organizations. In an organization that's a little bit smaller, I might flip that and say training. But if you think about what I was saying before and my definition for what sales enablement is, I talked about incentives. That's finance and HR. I talked about training. That's L&D. I talked about selling itself. Then there's the technology. There's the CRM. That is very cross-functional in nature. And if you don't have complete alignment, you will fail, no matter how good the strategy is, no matter how good your salespeople are. And the bigger you get, the more ground you try to cover, different markets, different products, it just becomes more of a cluster as you add more things if that alignment is not in place. So, and for a large organization, I would almost say alignment is number 1. If you can align on everyone saying one sentence that's really, really, really good about one product, that is more powerful than people being off and doing whatever they want to do.
Nice. Okay. So alignment is super important across all boards. And then how do you measure your success, but maybe I should ask first, how do you define your success?
So that goes back to the structure I talked about earlier. Success depends on the strategy. So here's one of the tricky things about sales enablement. Sales to me, I remember when I was in a job where I was running marketing and operations at a software brand. One of my biggest irritations was being in product meetings. And I respect everyone's opinion. People definitely have things that they can add to the table. But the engineers and product guys are always trying to tell me about, some marketing campaign they saw on YouTube and how we should be. Some jobs are jobs that everyone thinks that they can do because it is deceivingly simple. And with sales in particular, it is a practice. It's a trade almost. And you have to have the repetition. You don't have to be the smartest person. There's not necessarily a lot of things to know if your product is not complex, but you got to have that. You got to have that repetition. And so this really changes a lot, just really depending on the different organization that you're
in. So then how do you get alignment?
Yeah.
With those different departments and
like many things in sales enablement, one thing I think if I've learned one thing running sales enablement for an extremely large and scale business is that nothing is concrete. You really have to invest in building relationships, understanding where people are coming from. Because here's the thing, sales enablement, there are pieces of it that are really fun. Everyone has an opinion. And if you think about the personality, the stereotypical sales personality, and I know there's more than one, there's many prototypes, but one of the things that a lot of salespeople have is that they drive they take initiative. And if you aren't
Mhm.
providing something that they want, they'll just make something. They'll just do it anyway. And so it is the biggest herding of cats job that I've ever had in my life. Let's talk about how you actually do that. The key thing is to really, again, understand what's going on with that strategy. These different business units, do they have different strategies? Are they aligned on strategy? That's the really key thing, because if you think about or try to tap into what is most important to the senior leaders and what are they trying to drive, and how are you providing them what they need to drive that? Because this is also kind of a multi-step negotiation where over time you're building trust, and what you want is people who trust you implicitly to make them good
Mhm.
at this. In the beginning, no one's going to give you that. You have to get wins on the board and show them that what you're doing works. On the flip
Mhm.
side, you also got to understand how it's affecting the salespeople on the floor, because oftentimes the perspective of the executives is very different than how things are landing with frontline salespeople. And I
Mhm.
believe that the magic in driving alignment for sales enablement is really understanding both, bringing those two together, and making sure that everyone is in the boat, and also being able to allow each person to have some level of co-ownership, and not each person, but each major decision maker, so that they feel like they help to create it. Because if you try to give them something, especially sales leaders that are confident and hard driving A types, they would just look at what you have and reject it and do their own thing.
Never happened to anybody here before, right? In the
Never.
chat.
And I've never done it. I've never been guilty of it
Or
ever,
been guilty of doing
especially at
so.
Google.
um, so let's talk about, we have a lot of different size business owners and businesses with us today. How do these, one thing you had mentioned was for small business, you're kind of relying more on, the hiring process to find the great salesperson. How, in what other ways does sales enablement change with different size organizations?
The number of people who have to be at the table. And then sometimes it's not always about size. Sometimes it's about the actual product. So I
Mhm.
think the most difficult, or one of the more difficult sales enablement jobs, is probably a large organization with a complicated product. But small companies can have complicated products as well. One of the reasons why, even when I first began selling, I wasn't in software sales, but I was always envious of software salespeople because everyone knew that they made more money. And it was because they, a lot of times, have to explain so much about the product in order to make that sale. And so
Mhm.
size is an important factor, but it is only one part of a matrix of a number of different factors that will determine where you end up landing. There are some large organizations that have a very simple sale that they can teach fairly easily and send people out to do. And it's just about getting repetition. And there's others that are necessarily not that big, but if you're selling nuclear reactors, if you're selling one of Elon Musk's space missions, that's just a very different, more complicated sale. And you have also, one of those other factors is your customer and their level of sophistication, because ultimately that is the target. That's who you're trying to convince and influence. You want them to whip out a PO or whip out a Visa or an Amex and buy something. And you have to really understand what is it that they're looking for. And that's another variable that is somewhat independent from size of the
Mhm.
company.
Nice. Well said. Um, so can you tell me, you might have to go through your file of memories, but what was the biggest impact you've seen from an effective sales enablement program, either one that you did directly or you consulted on?
I think that the biggest impact that I have personally seen, I'm qualifying that because sales is, even though I think it almost flies under the radar, there are a lot of people in this field. One of the things that makes me proud about sales is that I think is one of the top fields where people are able um, to change their economic or their socioeconomic mobility, because it doesn't have a lot of barriers about like where you went to school or how much your parents have.
Mhm.
But the biggest impact that I've seen is when people have created new things. not because that's the only way to have impact, but from what I've seen, when there are new areas, as long as you have a alignment at the most senior level, there tends to be some priority that is driving.
Mhm.
So I can think of a particular team in my business that someone else led, one of my counterparts, and he was at that business when it first started as a rep, probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And I watched him grow and become the director of sales for that organization. And they have just been so impactful. And a lot of it just has to do with the fact that everyone agrees this is the priority. We're going to get this done, and we're going to give these folks the resources they need. So the biggest impact is just like the water is greener where you the grass is greener where you water it.
Mhm.
Sales enablement will have more impact where you're giving it resources and priority, because you can't do everything. You have to choose, and usually you can only do two or three things right, maybe at a time.
Mhm.
If you really want to institutionalize something, especially if it's net new and something that your sales team has not done before.
Mm. Love it. Um, how do you, when you're collecting, information, interviews, what have you, as far as, what those two, focus areas are going to be for the year. And I would focus on the salesperson. How do you know what complaints to do something about and which complaints should not be done something about? How do you, because I guess there's a lot of sales leaders on the line. They hear a lot of stuff from salespeople, how things need to be different. So how do you decide what to prioritize?
The simple answer is, what is it that blocks the strategy from being fulfilled? But with that being said, there's actually, if I'm really being truthful, there's a lot of personal opinion here. I mean, there's some people that care a lot about process and pipeline. There's some people who care all about training. Some people care all about fun. And a lot of it has to do with the sales manager, no matter how big a company is. What we find at Google is that most people see the company through the lens of their immediate managers, and there's research out there that I think corroborates with that.
Mhm.
And so a lot of it depends on the personal leanings of that manager, especially if your accountability model is a little bit lax and allows them more freedom. And that's why managers are so critically important. I would rather have a team of rock star managers and just average talent salespeople than the other way around,
Mm.
because they are the primary lever that you can really get a lot done if you can get them aligned, skilled, and marching in lockstep with the same accountability measures, the same conversation, the same method for coaching. You can do so much when you get the manager piece right.
We have a saying, old Italian grandma saying that the fish stinks from the head down.
Yeah, I concur.
So if there's a problem with the morale of the sales team, then look towards the management to see
Yeah.
where that might be coming from, all the way up the line, right?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you said all the way, because one of the traps that I have seen, and this is everywhere I've ever been. This is a human problem as I've experienced it. And that is, a lot of times with senior leaders in any system, you have to realize that the people at the top of that system are the ones who've benefited the most from the status quo. And that can be a challenge for change. Because if Ashley is sitting, she's the kingpin, the queen pin of the entire global operation. You're like, we're gonna make all these changes. She's like, it worked for me. It can be very
Mm.
hard, right, to drive that. And what tends to happen when there are problems, senior leaders often push the focus of accountability down to middle and frontline management. It's a very slippery slope. It happens in every company I've ever been in, and you really have to be vigilant.
Mm.
Um, and so checks and balances is a big part of this as well.
Mm. So let me ask that question then. When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, where does that get married with sales enablement? Like, how can we use sales enablement to fulfill those missions? Where do they come together, and how can we do better?
So the biggest ways where you see that intersecting is in two big areas from a sales enablement standpoint. And these things are not necessarily owned by sales enablement, but sales enablement should be interested. They should be in the meetings, giving input, and they should understand the data and help to drive decisions. And that's hiring. as well as all of the things that go with talent management, sponsoring, mentoring, promos, and what is good. Like what is a good salesperson? What do they have to do? What is a list of things? Right? Those are the areas where sales enablement doesn't own those things, but they absolutely need to be involved. The unfortunate and hardest thing about the DEI thing is that no matter who you're trying to focus on to help, it is a very personal thing. And after having done DEI at a fairly high level at different times at Google, sometimes I lean into it, sometimes I'm just too busy with my day job. But from what I have seen, um, you have to actually give up the idea that you're going to get everyone to see something one way. You have to understand what your priorities are, lay your strategy out, work with the willing, and make sure that you have people in power who can drive change and tell a compelling story, tell people why it benefits them. No matter what it is, we live in a competitive world of limited resources, no matter who you're trying to help. You can try to help dogs, and someone's going to be like, "Hey, well, if the dog gets that way, what do I get?" And so that takes, and I would not recommend that in sales enablement team really take on DEI because it's too big of a stinky fish to deal with. And there's too many other things that you will die as a sales enablement team if you don't get right. You're too busy. You have to focus on how are we impacting how who we're hiring and how they're moving through the system and be very loud there and really work with HR. And most important, the actual functional leaders in the business, every individual manager and every individual director, VP. And so even though I don't think it's a sales enablement category, but if you can influence training, if you have any power to influence training, any power to influence accountability, the metrics that matter, how we're measuring it, like that's where I would request or recommend that a sales enablement team have made suggestions, but don't take it on. It is someone else's job, and you don't have time to solve that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
It's everyone's job in terms of the people who are in your organization. You can't make a whole organization get DEI right and do sales enablement. You will be in a straitjacket before the end of the quarter. Those are two of the most honorary areas of the business.
Thank you. Well, let's look into the future then. What do we need to know about what's coming? Where do you see the future of sales enablement? So the question I have here is specifically about sales enablement technology. And what exciting things have you seen in the sales enablement technology space?
So I would say the three that have made the biggest impression on me, right, would be automation, which is a function of technology, ever-growing competition, and globalization. Nothing that I just said is unique. None of it is something that you've never heard before. But these are huge shifts, and we are, I think, are only at the tip of the iceberg of seeing how things are going to change because of these. So when you talk about automation, this is actually really depends on the industry. But at this point, I've sold insurance, I've sold car warranties, I've sold logistics services, financial services, as well as marketing ads. And in every business I've ever been in, that business was always marching toward more technological enablement 100% of the time, because it's just wise to do that. It brings great returns. And what that means for sales enablement is you got to go up the funnel. And people can't just go just like talking about the product and having it hand out for a sale. They really got to understand if it's B2B, people's businesses, if it's B2C, the customer's core problem, and really be able to engage them from their perspective and how they're going to solve that problem, not sell and push a product. Because a lot of these products and services are doing more and more for customers on their own. And you actually don't need salespeople to explain as much of it, depending on what it is. So I think that automation is a big piece of it. I would also say that starting a business is easier than it ever has been. Barriers of entry are low, 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 low. I mean, I was someone who, I guess, a bit of a dinosaur in terms of an online digital marketing hobbyist. I used to like build websites in the late 90s in college. And I can remember that, there are services that now you can sign up and pay, $30 a month, $15 a month for a SaaS software Well, before, if you didn't have $10,000 and an engineer to implement it for you with your own servers, you couldn't have it.
Mhm.
And so the barriers are so low that everyone's getting in. No one's business is unique. It's all about execution. And that's why sales, you see it rising up. People are talking about it more because it's becoming what you need to differentiate your people. When I was selling logistics, one of the things I realized looking back is what made that such a sales forward organization is that our product was the exact same as our main competitor. Our prices were the exact same. The only differences that would differentiate us were the service level and our salespeople. And so we had to lean in there. And then globalization, because you're not just competing with folks in Albuquerque or Miami, you're competing with Singapore, you're competing with India as they rise, you're competing with Ghana as they rise, and they want the same dollars that you want. And you also see that a lot of the big markets, if companies have done well here or wherever they are, and they want to grow, they got to look to other markets to get that growth. And every country is not the same in terms of what it means to do business there and the laws. And so those are the three things that I think are on the horizon that every sales enablement team should be looking at and action against them based on what the priority is in that business and in that business's strategy.
Cool. So let's dig in a little to automation, because any of us with a LinkedIn account are getting a lot of DMs about the latest sales tech tool that can help us do our jobs better. You don't have to name names if you don't want to, but what kind of tools do you rely on to better enable your sales teams?
There's really only one that I've seen
Okay.
outside of the company that I've been super impressed by. I won't name it. However, I'll say this. Most of what's out there is useless if you don't have the brilliant basics. And there are very few sales teams, especially teams that have not been selling for like decades, that has the brilliant basics down.
What are
My
the
company is
brilliant
a wonderful
basics?
company.
What are the brilliant basics?
Prospecting, pitching, negotiating, closing, getting the check. My company is an amazing company to do sales for. I don't think we have it down. And it has a lot more to do with our origin story and coming out of tech, where the tech industry typically hired people who already knew how to do the job, like engineers. So training was never a big part of those cultures in the way that Xerox has that as a part of their culture. And so that's kind of being built out now by people who've never experienced what good looked like in a lot of different tech companies. That's happening all over the world. So, those brilliant basics, I think what you also see happening, there's so much money in it for the companies, and if they're public, the stock, that you have people, those same folks who 20 years ago would never do sales, right? I would never sell. I would never be a salesperson. A lot of those people are like, hey, I'm a senior executive now. I want to run a sales team.
Nice.
I want to drive the revenue. I want those commissions, right? And so you have a lot of that happening. And so you have an environment where you have even less of a propensity to really have those brilliant basics down. And I'll tell you a quick story that I think of when I'm talking about this. I'm not just talking about other people. I've been there as well. When I was very, very, very young, like right out of college, I spent a little bit of my time in a network marketing company. That was actually the first time it wasn't telemarketing. That was the first time I ever sold anything, was network marketing. And I remember this guy who was very young, who was about my age, and he was making some pretty good money. And I was like, hey, would you help me with my business? I want to learn how to do it as well as you do it. And we talked. He's like, I really like you. You're a nice person, but you know what I've realized? I'm not sure if you're ever going to get to the top of this company. And he said, you're a nice guy, but you're very like bookie, schooly type person. And from what I have seen, people who do really good in this business, they're hustlers. Like they weren't necessarily, it's not that they're not smart, but like what they lean into is more so the woo and the swagger and not the academics of it. And so what you see happening, especially a lot of these big prestigious companies, a lot of these people who have a very academic way of looking at business have gotten into sales teams and they're messing it up because it is not that complicated. If you are spending years getting basic sales skills in place, you have the wrong people making some of those decisions.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said earlier, it is the biggest opportunity to move socioeconomic tiers. So you don't have to have gone to a tier 1 school. Often I found when I work with people, it actually doesn't matter what school they went to, but if they're very much in their head and analytical, we have to start bringing them down into their heart a little bit so they can connect people to people.
I was one of them. I thought I was going to be a PhD in engineering. It was starvation initially put me onto sales, and then I just fell in love with it, especially in the space that I'm in now. But I was taught a long time ago, if you can sell, you can eat, and I've never forgotten it. No matter when they have layoffs, someone always needs someone to sell their product or service. They may fire operations people, engineering people, HR people, but someone's got to push that product. And if you have that skill set, you can usually find something even in the down market. And so I really came into the space because of that. It was more about survival and trying to be shrewd about making sure that I didn't lose everything like I did in the earlier part of my career.
Nice. Well, you did mention a tool that you were excited about, and then we got derailed. Everyone's hanging on their edge of their seats.
I can't, for so many reasons.
Okay.
I can't.
All right. So,
but if someone sends me a message, I'll have a conversation.
You might be able to divulge some opinions. One last question. Where do you see the sales enablement space change in the next year, 5 years, and how do you see yourself playing a part in that?
I think it depends on your industry. And when you look back at those 3 factors I talked about earlier, of globalization, automation, and competition, it depends on how quickly those are coming to eclipse the status quo at a given company. There are some companies that if they don't make a change within a year or so, they're dead. There are other companies that are just fat on the revenue and they're aware of it and they're having very intellectual conversations about it, but not a lot is changing and nothing's making them change, but that won't always be the case. So again, I think the most important thing to have in terms of being a sales enablement leader is flexibility. You have to balance having structure because you have to be able to communicate a simple message. And I haven't always done that well, to be honest. I'm a very verbose person who likes to do public speaking and tell long stories, but you have to be able to tell a very clear message in order to do that well. But across different companies, across different industries, it's going to be very different, and you have to have that flexibility to understand how those are affecting your market. And you need to be in a space where you're having consistent conversations with the executives that drive strategy. And in every business, that's different. Sometimes an executive team drives it. And my company, we have these massive central teams of like ex-McKinsey partners and people who tend to drive that stuff. And so you really got to figure out like who is developing, who is deciding on priorities, who is developing strategy, who is creating the things that and making decisions about everyone else is going to have to do. And that's where you got to play. And there's no one playbook for that.
Nice. Well, we're going to move into some Q&A. Are you ready to take the hot seat for a little more?
I love the engagement.
All right. Well, it has been moving in the chat here. So I'm going to go in order, and hopefully I think we'll have enough time for everything that's come in so far. Joshua asks, Lawrence, is cold calling dead?
No, it's never dead.
What do you think about it?
No, I don't think cold calling is dead at all. I just think it's changed a lot. At the end of the day, not every company has the luxury to have an existing book of business and the brand that their customers know about. I mean, my first insurance sales job, I had to walk in the door of a business to someone who did not know me while they were operating their business. And I had a very specific script that I had to get out in 30 seconds and hope they didn't kick me out. That is not the same that it was in 2001, but it hasn't completely gone away because you will always have a company who is in that position. They don't have a big name. No one knows who they are. And those can sometimes be some of the most exciting companies to be a part of, especially if you have a lot of energy and you're more entrepreneurial. But if you're the business owner, that's why I say you need to hire people who've done it before. The fewer people you have to bet on, the less error you have the ability to make it. So you really can't really focus that much on training. You want experts who've done it. And a lot of times, in some sales jobs I've been in, way back in the day, you got to already have prospects, a list of prospects on your own to call. And that's old school, but it hasn't really changed. If anything, I think a lot of newer companies are trying to use technology to get around it, and they're failing. You cannot win the game without selling something, period. You cannot code your way around it, market your way around it, email your way around it, video your way around it. If you have a complex product, especially if it's B2B, someone's got to be telling that story and explaining things that are not going to be apparent just from looking at it, especially if it's a larger ticket item.
When I notice resistance in selling like that, I remind the salespeople that we need to do it this way as long as we're selling human to human. But one day when we're selling to AI, then maybe AI can do the job better than us. But for now, we still have a job.
For sure. And to me, that's just one of those slivers of perspective that is important and changes depending on your company, your industry, and where you see that going. And so I think when I was on sales teams as a frontline salesperson, sales operations people usually were like operations people who were trying to like get salespeople to do something off of a spreadsheet, or they were former sellers who were trying to learn how to use spreadsheets. And today you really have to be a business strategist, and you really got to understand how to get the priorities right. Because a lot of the tools in technology are making it easier for you to execute. And a lot of times it's not so much about like a magic product. It's really, what is the accountability that you have around the product, right? At the end of the
Right.
day, like for instance, when I was selling, every quarter I talked to every customer. There's no software. I mean, we had CRM that like tracked what I was doing, and I had to actually put in what I was saying. So the CRM was homemade. It was in-house. But the important part was there was accountability. I knew every day someone could see where I said that I had been, what did I say, what tools I use, I had to attach it, and they can look at the history. And the next person who got that account after me could see everything that happened with that account. So I think the accountability is more important than the actual tool. And I would encourage people to not get too jazzed out about tools. It's always about the basics in sales. And that boils down to simplicity, structure, and accountability.
Nice. Okay. So, where does the actual customer fit into all this strategy?
At the end of the day, I mean, they have the golden egg. They are always the target of strategy, and all the strategy does. I'm putting a caveat here. I love strategy, but I don't consider myself a strategy expert. I do work with a lot of strategy experts, and I try to sit next to them and let their expertise rub off on me. But at the end of the day, all strategy does is help you to prioritize how to choose the right customers and make sure that you're focusing on engaging them to influence their behavior, their buying behavior, so that they purchase what you have. That if it's any strategy that's doing that, it has failed. And it is the only thing that strategy should be focused on doing.
Nice. Well said. How is everyone changing their sales process with the industry shortages due to supply chain issues?
Again, it depends on industry. I think some industries are more dependent on supply chains than others. So I spent most of my time as a salesperson selling logistics for UPS, and that is an incredibly logistics dependent company. Although I will say one of the reasons why they're still around after, I don't know what it is now, 120 years, is because they really invested in technology that runs it on the back end. And that's really what powers that particular business. So I see, again, a lot of different responses to this. I'll give you an example. When I was selling there, one of the things that people were afraid of is what was going to happen, because we were at the time delivering all of Amazon's products and services or products. And that was the case until fairly recently. But I'm a avid Amazon shopper who hates to leave the house, to my wife's chagrin. And I cannot remember the last time a UPS truck dropped off an Amazon package at my house. So what you see is companies that are able to achieve scale, taking everything in-house to drive more efficiencies. But this isn't a problem for everybody. I mean, this is like typically large multinational conglomerates. I think for other folks, it's really just about how do I survive? How do I eat? Was that my only supplier? And I think that again, for smaller companies, this stuff is important, but you really got to dig more into the operation of what's happening every day. And you got to know it. I don't care if you're the CEO, the founder, you have to know what is happening every day because you're so exposed when something goes wrong or someone drops a ball. So thinking from a strategic perspective, like what are the backup plans that you have in place? If something happens in your supply chain, do you have different options at every point in the chain? Because when I worked at UPS, if something happened with one supply lane, there was a whole process in place where a semi truck could drive from Des Moines to Abilene and make sure those packages got there. And so it really is about thinking about it from that standpoint.
Nice. So Patrick would like to know, how often do you audit for friction in the sales process to improve it?
I would say that in our business, that is not a core competency that we've developed. And I actually think it's very easy to overlook in general. I think a lot of sales teams don't really do this at all, or don't do it as much as they should. Now, a lot of it does get solved organically, right? Because when things break, right, it presents problems that people have to solve. But when I hear that question, I'm not sure who asked it, but what I'm thinking about is you are really looking at every point on that value chain and understanding from an operations standpoint, where are the efficiencies, what's broken, where can we be better, and how are we optimizing that all the way along. There are very few folks that do that. You're doing good enough for people to respond to salespeople who are complaining about training not being good. So that's my perspective based on what I've seen, but it may be very different in other places. Again, it depends on the industry.
Patrick, you can chime in and let me know. Did you mean friction from the buyer's perspective of the buying process, or the sales process for the salespeople, how hard it is to do their job?
Well, yeah, I guess I was just more thinking about, I feel like that's where in a small business where I look at like a win-loss audit or something where you say, or where the sales team is complaining the most. I think it's sort of what Lawrence was saying, which I would agree with, where like when a problem arises, you squash it. So yeah, I think he answered it just fine. I would love to ask, I saw Coop ask this. I think it's a fun question. Best and worst professional advice you've ever received?
I would say the best professional advice I've ever gotten was to make sure, if you want to make money, make sure that you are operating very closely to where it's made in any company. Make sure you're aligned with whatever the priority is in that company. And I've got that as advice, and I live through it, because when you're working in a low priority area, it can be just very tough. Everyone has different tolerances for that. I have a hard time with it. So that's probably the best. The worst I've gotten was actually great advice, but it was bad for me because I got it not at a time where I could really use it. And I was really inspired by, there was a commencement address that Sheryl Sandberg gave to, I think it was a Harvard Business School MBA class of either 2013 or 2012, somewhere up in there. And she said, get on a rocket ship, because when you get on a rocket ship, careers take care of themselves. That's fantastic advice, but it wasn't advice that I could really action on at that time, because I was already about to work when it was a great company, but already really big. So that would have been nice advice to get, like when I was like a much younger person. And I do think that salespeople should be looked at, although a lot of them are trite after a couple of years. There is a long-term investment element to that for the ones that are going to stick around, and investing in those people's capabilities, I think it's just a really smart investment, because the better those folks are, the better trained they are. They will create the environment for you. They'll create the level of expectation for you, so that people who are slacking can't survive when they come into the company.
Nice. Okay, so we have about 5 questions left, so I want to do a speed round. So we'll see if we can do these in like less than a minute, which you've been doing pretty good on anyway. But I want to make sure we get everyone's. So what's the best way to take learning from the field back to your marketing and support teams to implement change to help you sell?
The best way is to do it through CRM and drive accountability around salespeople telling you who they saw and what they said, even if it's just bullet points, because you got to be able to look at this stuff broadly and be able to like chop it up and work with different cuts on the data. That's the best way that I've seen. Now, I've seen companies that are good at crunching data, but don't do that. And I've seen companies that do that, but don't crunch the data well, but doing them together, I think is the best approach.
Nice. Okay. What do you suggest when the top has no idea how to help you sell more?
You mean like vice presidents and executives? When you say the top, like the top executives in the company?
Would you like to unmute and elaborate?
Yeah, that is exactly it. From your managers to the top, especially in instances where they don't necessarily have the direct experience in that specific field or industry.
Yeah. You have to figure out how to influence them or find a different job. And that's not as harrowing as it sounds. I think that, and I've experienced this before, when you have done a lot of sales, there are a lot of things that to you are second nature, just like anyone who's done something a lot. And it can be extremely frustrating to be dealing with someone that has a lot of decision-making power that you feel doesn't get it. Maybe they do, maybe they see something that you don't, right? But you feel that they're not getting it. That can be extremely frustrating. But what I've learned is that part of this job is getting them to see it, because sales enablement typically should be at the intersection of the executive suite, if it's not an executive job in and of itself. And so it's just a different kind of conversation. Like my biggest job is influencing executives is very tiring, because when people have been successful, they kind of like to do their own thing. And so you have to figure out how to influence. I would go back to Cialdini books. I would put yourself in classes, get training, write out a strategy, and approach it like a game. And I think when I begin to do that, it began to be less friction in the process for me personally.
Love that. What recommendation, this is from Amanda, would you provide to a new sales enablement leader in the process of building their org? How should they spend their first 30, 60, 90 days?
Understand who all the decision makers are. Understand how decisions are made, and understand the priorities. Spend 90 days doing that, and check again and check again and check again, and make a deck and send it out and let people look at it, and then change it, and then send it out again. And then like, you really got to nail that, because that is the foundation that everything is on top of. Once you do that and things start to land really well and you begin to build that credibility, you can fly. But if it doesn't go well, you're going to have a very hard road to go. And as trust wanes, almost the worst people to deal with are people who don't know what good looks like, because they can't even see that, oh, like this is actually not so bad. We just need to do this differently. They may just throw the whole thing out, or believe that we're going to do something else over here that they don't have any expertise in, but they're like pulling at straws to make it work.
Okay. In your experience, this is from James, what is the common trait you see in the best salespeople, and what drives
Tenacity
them?
and grit. That's it. If you got that, you can sell eventually. It may take you longer. Everyone does not have a silver tongue. Some companies, a lot of old school companies, sad to say, but they were very much into like way people looked and dressed. It depends on who you're working for, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the grittiest people always end up winning. In this game. Probably in life, in sales. It's not about smarts, because sales is simple. The more you try to over intellectualize it, you're screwing up the whole thing. You're just messing up the pasta.
Messing up the what? The pasta?
The pasta.
I like that. Well, the fish stinks from the head down, and don't mess up with the pasta, right?
I'm trying to riff off of you and keep it going. I like the theme.
I heard the fish reference earlier too. Well, thank you so much. The chat is blowing up with thank yous and
thanks for
bang
having
bang
me.
And boom boom and amens. Thank you so much for joining us, Lawrence. Yes, I see the applauses emojis coming up. This might be the first meeting I ever ended on time, so I'm gonna give myself a pat on the back for that. Thank you all for joining us. Please check out Lawrence on LinkedIn. Please check out Nerdwise and connect with them for all your prospecting needs. And thank you for joining us tonight. Happy Thanksgiving.